Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I'm going to be talking about Dungeons and Dragons. Its year of history in 1975. The history of Dungeons and Dragons, specifically in 1975, and I'm going to be looking at that year through the filter of CLEAR, an acronym that I use to build adventures for tabletop role-playing games. CLEAR is catalysts, locations, entities, artifacts, and relationships. Okay. So, who is a catalyst for Dungeons & Dragons history in 1975? Robert J. Kuntz. Robert J. Kuntz in 1975 aids Gary Gygax in creating Greyhawk, one of the first worlds for Dungeons & Dragons. So, Robert J. Kuntz is a harbinger of source books, okay? So, in 1974, we had the D&D White Box, which is the first boxed set for Dungeons & Dragons. It's the first box set for any tabletop role-playing game on the planet. There'll be a long history of every single edition will have a box set, and every single edition will have source books of Dungeons & Dragons. And Greyhawk is one of the first worlds and one of the first source books for Dungeons & Dragons, coming literally 1 year after its after Dungeons & Dragons creation. Robert J. Kuntz is a catalyst in aiding Gary Gygax in creating Greyhawk, which would be one of the very, very first settings for Dungeons & Dragons, okay? The location for 1975 is Boston, Massachusetts. So 1974, Gary Gygax brings Dungeons & Dragons into existence, and he's a primary catalyst for that. And in 1975, in Boston, Massachusetts, in libraries, in universities, at bookshops, in cafes, Dungeons & Dragons is played in Boston, Massachusetts. The game, Dungeons & Dragons, the first tabletop role-playing game now, radiates out from Middle America all the way to the largest and even some of the smallest cities of the East Coast. And Boston, Massachusetts is right there with many game enthusiasts, story enthusiasts, intelligent people, creative people, artistic people in Boston playing Dungeons and Dragons. And so we see the game radiate out to the East Coast. And Boston, Massachusetts is a key location for D&D 1975. All right. An entity, Gerald Ford, right? Gerald Ford becomes one of America's few placeholder presidents, a president who is president for the United States of America, not because he was elected by the people, but because of the tragic, massive political events surrounding Richard Nixon losing his presidency and a placeholder president, Gerald Ford, stepping into place. He is an entity there. Gerald Ford is shaping the 1970s and shaping the world that Dungeons & Dragons exists in within our IRL world, right? Artifact, right? Artifact for 1975 D&D is the simple wooden table that Gary Gygax plays the game on in his home in Lake Geneva, okay? Now, why would a simple wooden table be an artifact? Well, one reason why it's an artifact is that table, right, is literally an artifact today. Right now, last year, Art and Arcane was brought out for Dungeons & Dragons, and one of the things that book did was the authors of that book talked about archaeology being done to get pieces of art that are 44 years old, right? Knowing that these pieces of art, the original pieces of art for Dungeons & Dragons, could end up in the Smithsonian, in one of the Smithsonian museums, right? And the reality is, the table that the first Dungeons & Dragons game was played on is an artifact. I'm not sure anyone owns it. I don't know if it's sitting in a Raiders of the Lost Ark crate somewhere, but it should be, right? And that simple wooden table even to this day, is a massively important artifact because Dungeons and Dragons was played on a table. Its first iteration, and in 1975, as Gary Gygax continues to realize the power of what he has created, right? That he is saying, he is playing at a wooden table, but he doesn't actually know that the fact that Dungeons and Dragons is played at a table will be incredibly important in the years to come. It would distinguish tabletop role-playing games from other types of games, which we're going to talk about in a minute, right? But specifically, it would also distinguish it from LARPs, from live action role-playing games, which will explode onto the scenes in the 90s, right? Specifically through the World of Darkness games. And so, basically, and those were very, very important games. Live action role-playing would be very closely bound to tabletop role-playing games, but the table would split off. Also, today in 2018, that simple wooden table calls to every single player saying, this is how the game was originally played. And yes, you can sit at your computer desk and play while you're in Oklahoma and play with somebody who lives in Japan, but this game was played at a simple wooden table where friends physically gathered and sat next to each other. And that simple wooden table serves as a powerful artifact in 1975 to just be the literal foundation for the game, allowing multiple books to be used, allowing paper and pencil to be out, and for people to be exchanging ideas through the written word and through the verbal word, because they can hear each other because they're proximally based, they're close to each other, and also for miniatures to be used. All this requires significant space, right? And to this very day, that wooden table continues to call every single player back to the original source, back to the quite literal foundation of the game itself, what we put all of our game components on, the simple wooden table. And Gary Gygax was using his simple wooden table in his home in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and that is the artifact for 1975. What is the relationship in 1975 for Dungeons & Dragons, the game, the key relationship? It is D&D, the letters, lowercase D&D. It is the first video game created that is directly influenced by Dungeons and Dragons. It was called the letters D&D. It is created in 1975. 1 year after the creation of 1974, Dungeons and Dragons immediately becomes a focus point for video game developers and for the video game industry. And to this very day, absolutely not a single historical book about video game history does not list Dungeons and Dragons as an absolutely massive, integral, right, element within video games. The flow of influence goes Dungeons and Dragons influences video games. Many, many, many years later, video games will slightly influence Dungeons and Dragons. But the reality is, from 1975 forward, Dungeons and Dragons, through its use of levels, through its use of systematic storytelling, through its use of homage to Tolkien and a million other reasons, will become a foundational element, a core ingredient of video games, one of the largest industries that America has ever seen. And so the key relationship of 1975 with Dungeons and Dragons is with video games. And that is a J. Scott Garibay clear history of Dungeons and Dragons in 1975. Thank you. Please let me know your thoughts below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful day.